for questions. If you have questions, you can type your questions into the Q&A portion and we'll get to them later. You can go ahead and type them in as we go so you don't forget what you wanted to ask. I'm Kathleen Johnson and this is Jan Weiss-Miller. We are joining you from Prairie Lights Bookstore in Iowa City, Iowa. Art Cullen is joining us from Storm Lake, Iowa. He's a Pulitzer Prize winner and is the editor and co-owner of the Storm Lake Times. He's the author of Storm Lake, Change, Resilience, and Hope in America's Heartland. He's also a frequent contributor to and is published regularly in the New York Times, Washington Post, and The Guardian. Amy Klobuchar is the senior senator from Minnesota. She was the first woman from that state to be elected to the US Senate. She was born in Plymouth, Minnesota, and graduated from Yale and University of Chicago Law School. She is the chair of the Antitrust Subcommittee and the author of The Senator Next Door and Antitrust. Please welcome Amy Klobuchar and Art Cullen. Thank you for joining us. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kathleen. Welcome back to Iowa, Senator. It's been a while since the caucuses.
I thought Kathleen did a beautiful job, and thank you, Jan. I love Prairie Lights, but I did think it was funny. And I visited, for some reason, all 99 counties in Iowa, but I had a wonderful time. Just that little part of my bio, and was in Iowa City many times, and it is with you as well, Art, at Storm Lake, and it's just great to be back and see you and your groundbreaking work in this area. You were, as I said many times before, you were ahead of your time. And what I really like about this is you won't have time limits like debates.
Right.
Me, I'm not competing with anyone. Anyway, go ahead, please.
Well, back when Reagan was president, we liked to call Bob Dole our third senator, our conduit to the White House. We'd like to claim you at this time as our third senator from Iowa. Since, as you said at the Heartland Forum in Storm Lake, you could see Iowa from your front porch. And the book is a tremendous review of history and of antitrust, with a lot of specific suggestions on how we can move forward. And maybe you could just talk a little bit about why you wrote the book in the first place.
Mm-hmm. Well, a lot of it is what drove you to get into this, Art. I just started seeing all this consolidation and the effect it was having on everyday people, whether it's farmers trying to grow their crops, small farmers, whether it is the cable rates for people, whether it is no privacy on tech platforms, because monopolies don't have to do that stuff if they don't want to, or whether significantly for me, it is the price of pharma. And the reason I started the book with a story about pharmaceuticals is, well, first of all, I personally have seen this. My daughter, EpiPens, we saw those prices shot up when there was less competition. We saw many people watching this, saw it with insulin. But this story, I was a brand new US Senator, and this company called Ovation cornered the market on the drugs that fixed heart defects in newborn babies. One of them was called indomethacin, and the other one was neoprene. And what happened was, the minute they had both drugs under their control, they jacked the price up from $85 a treatment, where it had been pretty much for years, up to $1,600 a treatment. And I found out because a pharmacist, good players in this story, called me from Minneapolis Children's, told me the story. I called the head of the hospital. He said it's a disaster. And then we found out nationwide it was costing millions and millions of dollars for hospitals who are eating the costs, for families, for nurses, doctors, you name it. And then I brought it to the attention. The FTC held up a vial in a hearing and said, I'm brand new, but you better do something about it. They brought a major case, joined by attorney generals in a number of Midwestern states, including red states. And guess what? It got thrown out of court because of conservative precedent and the fact that you had such blatant facts. It was a controversial decision, such blatant facts, and we still couldn't make a dent in it. I knew that we have to build a populist movement to change the laws and to make sure the agencies have the funds they need to take on when some cases are the biggest companies the world has ever known. And it's time to make antitrust cool again.
Yeah, let's go back a little bit. when antitrust was cool. Tell me about the empire builder, James J. Hill. He's got a great quote.
Yeah. Oh, give me the quote about give me Swedes and whiskey and I'll build a railroad to
Swedes,
hell.
stuff, and whiskey, and I'll build you a railroad to hell. Yeah.
This is what shows that I wrote every detail in my book. I remember it. So anyway, although my husband did the footnotes, a story for another day. But the fact is that James J. Hill was one of the original robber barons. My mom, when I was growing up, would take me by his mansion. He was long since deceased. When we would look at Christmas decorations, and she would say things like, "Yeah, your relatives on my dad's side built that house." Well, that was a metaphor. They didn't really build the house, but in fact, my great grandpa was brought over to work from Slovenia to work in the mines to support the monopolists in northern Minnesota, right the same year that James J. Hill built that house. And our story was like a lot of Americans. They got opportunities they wouldn't have had if the people weren't building stuff, railroads, you name it, in our country. So that was good. But the bad part was when you have monopolists, you don't have a lot of incentive to bring up wages. You don't have a lot of incentives for safety in the mines. And so the Midwestern piece of this, and specifically my family's piece of it, is significant. And my James J. Hill ended up being one of the guys in the trust, the very first trust that Teddy Roosevelt took down, Northern Securities Trust. And so that part of the story is amazing as well. But I think in the end, I think you know this, Art, Iowa, I start one of the chapters with the story passed the first state law that was comprehensive on monopolies. And Minnesota and Iowa, Wisconsin, Nebraska played a critical role in this because of our farmers standing out there with pitchforks, our workers in Chicago that were striking. The Midwest was key to making progress on antitrust back then.
But it seems like we've been bringing it back home here to an Iowa audience. It seems like we've been fighting this battle since 1910 when they organized the Fort Worth stockyards, the three big packers, and took over the cattle market back then, and they haven't let go since. And through 100 years, we've been living with the consolidation, price fixing in the meat packing industry, and it kind of came to a full head in the pandemic last April, when the Waterloo and Sioux Falls meatpacking plants, Tyson and Smithfield, had to shut down for a week. Food prices shot up 50%. You couldn't get food on the meat counter. And they were terrorizing vulnerable employees through the American Meat Institute and the Trump administration. They were colluding against their own workers to force them into unsafe workplaces. And it kind of exposed how big and brittle and how tightly woven this ag supply chain is. Hogs are backing up into southern Minnesota that couldn't get into the only plant they could get to, Storm Lake. And we were in a food crisis, we were in an agricultural crisis, and we were in a labor crisis all at the same time. And it seems also that Smithfield, half their slaughters go into China. JBS, the other big pork packer, is Brazil Incorporated, which is a subsidiary of China Incorporated. How do we break up these big meat packers to make them more diversified, to protect their workers? And what's on the other side of antitrust if we ever get there with these outfits?
What a question. So let's start with what you've focused on here. And that is that the pandemic really put a big magnifying glass on problems which you pointed out existed before. And what's interesting about this, the other people who have been talking to me about this extensively are Republican senators behind the scenes, because they found out from their farmers, not just with what happened right when the pandemic hit and there were safety concerns and some of the plants shut down, and we all remember that moment, but actually since then, that they just haven't had choices of where to bring their cattle or to bring their hogs, and the effect that has had on them and on pricing. So one of the reasons that I introduced a bill that was more comprehensive, that isn't just about tech, as bad as the tech stories are, and we can get to that in a minute, is that I think you have to look beyond just one industry. We have seen consolidation across the board, and we're going to be having a hearing on ag, and it's of course things like seeds as well. I got some incredible figures before I got here on the cost of purchasing a seed to plant 1 acre of soybeans between 95 and 2011, and corn increased 325%, 259% respectively, but yields per acre only increased 18.9% and 29.7%. And so that's just another example. And you also see it in agricultural equipment and the like. So it's very important. We're going to have a hearing on this. I just confirmed it with my Republican counterpart, as well as sort of the whole food supply chain that you referred to with grocers and the like. So that's an important piece. But the reason I did the bill comprehensive is I want us to have the ability, one, get our agencies funded. They are literally working with duct tape and Band-Aids to take on the biggest consolidated companies the world has ever known, including Facebook and Google. And guess what? They are a shadow of their former selves under Ronald Reagan. I mean, come on. And so Grassley and I, Senator Grassley of your home state, have a bill, and I'm so glad he's leading on this, to change the fee structure for the big mega mergers, so that the big companies are paying more. It's a drop in a bucket to them. Then that money's going to go to the agencies, over $100 million, FTC, Department of Justice, Antitrust. And he's pretty vociferous about that. We actually got it. We're going to have a markup on it this week in the Judiciary Committee. And it's the first real, I'd say, shot against the bow to say, we're serious, we want to fund the agencies. Second thing is, let's look back at these markets. We want to change the merger standards. I do going forward. That's in my big comprehensive bill, which right now is Democrats, but there's a lot of Republicans talking to me about pieces of it. Making it so that the big companies actually have to show that the mergers don't hurt competition, as opposed to the government after having to show that it does. And then the big Lollapalooza issue is looking at industries as a whole, not just accepting it as it is, and giving the government the ability to say, you're going to have to divest this part of an operation, or we're going to put some conditions on. Amazing hearing we just had on app stores. Hopefully we can get to that, and some of the work that's being done in that area. And to me, I guess I would embrace what John Oliver said after this incredible half-hour segment he did on monopolies, where after going through all these areas, sunglasses, cat food, he finally said, if all of this consolidation is enough to make you want to die, good luck, because there's only 3 casket makers left. And guess what? Our one bought the other. Right. So there's only 2.
Right. Yeah, well, they've ruined Iowa. What we used to have an independent pork market. We don't anymore. Those guys that were buying new pickups every other year, that were raising hogs independently, they're gone. And can we recreate that system?
Surprisingly, when there's been intervention in much even bigger things like the breakup of AT&T, new competitors do emerge, and we have the ability, as we did during the pandemic, for startups. Anyone can start a company. The issue is so many of them either get gobbled up if they're at all successful, or they just go by the wayside. And so when you have an aggressive antitrust enforcement and you're willing to make the laws as sophisticated as the companies that it is supposed to regulate, you do spur on more competition. That's been proven from the past throughout history.
Do you sense that this is the moment? You note in the book that a lot of people in rural Minnesota voted for Trump because they're just fed up with being flown over and ignored and left out of America's prosperity. And do you sense that this is the moment to really take action, and we can actually get somewhere if you have Ben Sasse and Chuck Grassley on board?
Mm-hmm. I do think this is a moment like no other. And I would point out, I think Joe Biden is doing some pretty progressive things to help people right now through this pandemic, and has big plans, including issue I sure learned a lot about in Iowa, which was the childcare deserts. And Joe and Kamala are working really hard on these issues. I think it's important. But as for antitrust, yes, There is a lot of bipartisan work going on both the House and the Senate. And, you know, I don't believe in a monopoly for my legislation, even though it's the most controversial, comprehensive legislation. To some, a big piece of legislation is controversial. And so I think it's the way to go. However, if we end up dividing it up into pieces, breaking it up, so to say, passing different parts of it. And the Klobuchar-Grassley bill is actually one of those parts. You know, I think that's a good thing. And doing more on pharma, something that Senator Grassley has also been out front on. I think that's going to be really, really important. Taking on the negotiation of prices under Medicare. I lead that bill in the Senate, and Senator Sanders has always been behind that. It's surprising where we can find reimportation of drugs from Canada. Another thing I'm doing with Grassley, as well as there's a bunch of Republicans in the House that support that. So I actually
this is where bipartisanship begins.
Right. And so, you know, there's some people, of course, on their side that continue to believe, and many of them, that the election was rigged and that there was fraud and all this stuff that's not true. And it makes me sick to my stomach. But I still am going to find the people I can work with for common ground whenever I can, because in the end, when it gets to the tech issue, if we continue to allow just a few companies to be gateways over all of our information, you're not just going to have one insurrection. You're going to have more. You're not going to have 25% of people not wanting to get vaccines because they believe this stuff that, as one of my neighboring cafes I went into, the guy working there said his mother-in-law wouldn't get the vaccine because she'd heard they plant a microchip in her arm because she read it on Facebook. This is actually happening right now with this misinformation. And so I want to allow new companies to come in. Let's say Instagram and WhatsApp, if they hadn't been bought by Facebook, maybe they would have developed the bells and whistles on misinformation and privacy that'll protect the American consumers. We'll never know, because Mark Zuckerberg, in his own email that was discovered in the House, said, "We'd rather buy than compete." And in another email, he said, and these are his words, "Yeah, they may be nascent, but their brands are meaningful. And here's the killer: they could be disruptive to us." Well, competition is supposed to disrupt things. Tech is supposed to disrupt things. And so that's why I firmly believe I don't want to destroy these businesses. They've been very, very important to us during the pandemic. They've, you know, Fitbit, all kinds of iPhone, all kinds of, these are my products that I own, all kinds of innovative products. We get that. Amazon, we get that. But if you use history as a guide, which I know you do, Art, and you go back to Iowa and what happened at the beginning days with the Granger movement and the like, we have rejuvenated capitalism. We get new things like new phones with AT&T, and then we go, okay, you guys got way too much power. We're going to mix this up a bit, put on some controls, allow new competitors to develop. That's why it's been bipartisan in the past. Sherman was a Republican of the Sherman Act, Teddy Roosevelt, a Republican, William Jennings Bryan, a Democrat. So it has been, they were competing with each other over who could do much on antitrust. And I think that should be our guide.
Can you talk a little bit about how Amazon combines with the other tech companies to limit free speech, to drive bookstores like Prairie Lights? Thank God Prairie Lights is with us.
Yeah, exactly.
Talk a little bit about how that restricts the free flow of information and how it's a threat to democracy.
Mm-hmm. So you want to have books published and you want to have newspapers reporting the news. And the problem is when you have one big guerrilla company that's the gateway, as I said, you may have startups happen, but it's really hard for them to compete. And a lot of times what happens is the monopolies put the prices low first. And so then what's happened throughout history, and you see some of this now, companies, smaller guys can't compete with that. And then you think, oh, great, I guess I get a better deal with the big guy. But then there's only one big guy left. And then they can increase their prices. That's what they've done over the years. That's why we have laws on the book, because economists, including Adam Smith, the father of our modern capitalist system, who way back said to the founding fathers, yes, the invisible hand, capitalism, but he also said, beware the standing army of monopolies. Those were his words. So I really believe if you look at little bookstores, or most significantly newspapers, which leads me to a very important topic, which is a bipartisan bill I have with Senator Kennedy of Louisiana, and Cicilline and Buck, bipartisan, have it in the House. I think it's Buck, but Cicilline has it in the House. It is a bill that tells the newspapers, news organization, it's okay if you coordinate, which they're otherwise not allowed to do, when it comes to negotiating for prices with the tech companies. Because you look at Australia, Google and Facebook literally said to them, oh, we don't want to pay what you want us to pay for content, government of Australia, entire industrialized nation. We're just going to take our marbles and go home. Good luck, because Google says we're 90% of the search market. Microsoft says, okay, I'll help out, which was great, but they're less than 5% market share right now. Yeah. So it just shows what a monopoly can do. And what happened was there was so much world pressure from the US, including me, from Europe, and they actually backed down from threatening to leave. But I'm telling you, we must have a free press. And it's not just the big guys. It is also newspapers in Storm Lake. It is newspapers in Lanesboro, Minnesota, and in mid-sized markets like the Twin Cities and Milwaukee. If we don't have newspapers that can look into, investigate corruption, investigate what's going on, there is no way a few big news organizations are going to be able to do that and get the local information like you need it. And that's why it's so important for our democracy.
Before we open it up to the audience, let me talk about my one final pet issue.
Okay, here we go, Art.
Yeah. We're at the cusp. I mean, the world is on fire. California literally was on fire. We are at the cusp of transforming agriculture into a new era of prosperity through conservation and renewable energy. And what do you see the prospects, again, on a bipartisan basis, in moving forward with Biden's climate plan, particularly as it relates to agriculture?
Yeah, well, let's start there. And Senator Stabenow has worked really hard on a bill that is good, that would further the use of cover crops, something we've talked about a lot in Iowa since one of the pilots went to Iowa over the last few years on doing that, making sure that farmers are compensated for something that would be very helpful to the environment. And there is a lot that farmers can do to be on the front line of this because of the benefits we're going to get from things like water conservation and new technology with precision ag, and making sure that we've got cover crops in place and using the CSP and CRP programs effectively, funding those for our farmers. The renewable piece of this, from everything from solar to wind to renewable fuels, which actually are better for the environment, we know, than oil, all of that is a piece of the solution. And what we're seeing now with the infrastructure plan that President Biden has put forward is a major emphasis on this, as well as the administration is going to be able to develop its own clean power rules. We joined the Paris Agreement. And it's going to forever.
What's all that going to do for Iowa and southern Minnesota?
Well, I think we've been, Iowa and Minnesota have been ahead of their time in terms of some things like the development of wind and manufacturing of wind. I think that would be good. We're not oil states. We're states that like to do some renewables. And I think that's going to be a big benefit to us. And so I think we should start seeing it this way. The other thing is the new EPA secretary. I had a long talk with him about electric co-ops and the fact that they're on different timetables, sometimes in the big guys and some of the projects that they're undertaking. He has a firm understanding of this, Regan, from North Carolina. I think it's good he's from a state that has a lot of rural. And remember, the last time the EPA secretary went to Iowa, he had to leave because renewable fuel, those farmers, it was great, stood up and we're so mad about the waivers to the oil companies. And it's funny, I brought this up to the new guys, like, I am well aware of that situation. I don't think we're going to see waivers to a bunch of big oil companies anymore.
Right. Well, let's open it up for questions from the audience.
Very good.
Okay.
Oh, there they are. They're back. Kathleen, Jan. Hi.
Okay. Well, we have one question here, kind of along those lines, is do you also plan to address the right to repair laws that hit Iowa farmers very hard?
Yeah, do you want to explain how that's impacted Iowa farmers to me a little bit, Art, in your own local way?
Well, it's kind of like dealing with seed companies. You have to buy their products, and when
Exactly, it's a monopoly issue. Oh, yes.
you can
Okay.
only go to the John Deere or Harvester store or the Case store.
Right. And I think this should be part of the hearing that we have on the food supply issues, because of the fact that this equipment is so complex now. And you can't even have outside maintenance companies to fix it. And so it's like a monopoly. Not only, there's only a few ag manufacturers around, and then have to go to them to get it fixed. And so you literally are captive customer on both the purchase end and the fix end. And so, I think that that should be part of the discussion as well. And I've heard a lot of farmers in Minnesota talk about it. It isn't just Iowa.
All right, the same person says, I'm a huge fan, Senator. Would you consider a prescription drug registry for controlling pharma price gouging like Canada?
Yes. I mean, I think the two things, and I was so glad I was in that small group that was at the State of the Union, and was so glad that the president, and I actually asked about this leading into the State of the Union to make sure that this would come up, that he made a major heartfelt pitch about the negotiation of drugs. So I'm just telling you what I think are some of the things going on here with drugs in the US, and registry something to consider. In fact, there's a House bill that puts limits on some of the most popular drugs, tying it to other prices, which I think would be a good idea and would give taxpayers back a bunch of money. Secondly, the negotiation of prices under Medicare. I figure the tens of millions of seniors in the United States of America could drive a pretty good bargain, but they're not allowed to. And that would be so helpful. Bringing in the less expensive drugs from Canada and other countries, they're literally paying, depending on the year, 4 times to 10 times cheaper than we get the drugs. And that's crazy. We could re-import the less expensive drugs. Generics, making it easier to get generics on the market. Something I just talked to Senator Leahy tonight. He led that bill, and Senator Grassley was also supportive of that, along with Mike Lee and myself. So making that easier to get that done would be a really good thing with pharmaceuticals. And then if you've noticed, President Biden has now come out this week for making the patents available on the drugs for coronavirus, on the vaccines, more available to the rest of the world. I think all of these things are things when the US has paid so much of the research way back for the pharma companies, when prices just won't go down. And when you see monopoly behavior, there's a way to handle it comprehensively, which I want to do to make the standards easy. But there's some pharma specific things we should also be doing.
I want to just remind people that if you have a question, you can click the Q&A portion of the bottom of your screen and type it in. You can be anonymous, or you can use your name.
I won't know who you are. It'll be like questions are going to suddenly come in, like, what about this with Storm Lake? Oh, I wonder who wrote that question.
Senator, maybe you could just take a moment to describe. It's kind of a in the weeds, but it's really important, I think, for people to understand the concept of monopsony. And how it's not just consumers that should be considered in a commercial transaction, but it should also be the labor, the producer, et cetera. That everybody has to be considered in that equation.
Right, because you can have a situation where people have no other choice but to really sell to a monopoly. And that's what this definition of monopsony involves, this whole ecosystem where they have control over things. And I think one of the things that is really hard about this is you have a lot of businesses that know this, small businesses, even workers at companies, and they're afraid to come forward and talk about it. That's why we're holding these hearings, because they're afraid of what it would mean. They would get cut off from working for or selling to a monopoly. Great examples outside of the monopsony area of this monopoly power. I feel like I've now become a support group for people who have been screwed or are getting screwed by this, and they're calling me, but they don't always want to go public. But we got at that app hearing, and this is because Apple controls all that app store that you get things on, and that's on their phones, and then Google controls the other phones. Okay, so what's happened is people have websites, right? I bet your Prairie Lake bookstore has a website, but increasingly the app stores have become the web, and Americans spend 4 hours a day on the app stores. Now, a lot of apps are free for small businesses. That's great. But it seems like anytime someone gets big enough and is in their product line, then they start charging them. Are you ready? If you're Spotify, 30% of the revenues bought on the app stores go directly to Apple from Spotify. Then Spotify has no choice but to have their product on there, as does Tile, who testified, and then the best of all, Match.com, who reported to us at this very intense hearing in the Senate subcommittee that the night before the hearing, a Google business person had called the Match.com business person and said, "We read your testimony. And when we read it, what your guy is going to give the company's testimony, what your witness is going to say tomorrow, we think it might conflict with what you said to your shareholders when you said that." So they're threatening them when you said you were going to work with us as Google. Now here you are testifying against us. So we've asked a series of questions, bipartisan, Mike Lee and I, of exactly what happened here, and whether there should be an investigation of them intimidating a witness. So my point of all this is getting to the monopsony is did him an interview with him, sort of the Art Cullen of late night, and it was a very amusing interview. Okay, but I told my John Oliver story, and then he's so hilariously spontaneous, Colbert. So I just tell that story I just told you guys, and then after about a minute, he goes, "Hey, cut the John Oliver part," to his staff on the thing it showed on TV, and I go, "Wait a minute, are you a gatekeeper? Are you being a monopoly?" He goes, "Yes, I'm a gatekeeper of my own show." And then here's the best part. He looks at the screen, he goes, "And I just want to say something, Google, I love you. I love you." Joking about how he wanted to be up higher on the search engine by doing that. Right. And so that's what you're talking about. People are afraid to come forward against monopolies because they don't know what mean. And that's why I wrote this book, because I think it's really important that people understand what they're up against. And it doesn't mean these companies are all bad. It doesn't mean they haven't given us incredible products and gotten people through the pandemic. But again, you can have those companies and still push them to divest some of their assets where you can make conditions and laws that say you cannot make your products above other ones on your search engine, or how it's done on you can't do that, because that would be anti-competitive. And that's a more sophisticated version of what they did way back in the Gilded Age, when they had to do this with a blunter instrument. And we just can't hide because this stuff is complicated.
Okay. Senator, if you and Art are successful in enforcing new antitrust measures in the ag and tech industries, how will life in rural and small town Iowa change? How different will it be from what it is now?
Well, what I want is that you can once again be successful when you're not a big gorilla on the block, that you find a way to transport your goods to market that's reasonable for you because some protections have been put in place. That you have broadband, by the way, which Iowa's been pretty good on to begin with, but a lot of places isn't, that allows you to compete in a big way. These are all things that hurt small companies or farmers, because if they can't compete with the big guys, if they don't even have the technology to do it, that's a problem. So that's a related part of this, that you're able to launch a business and then grow it if you want to, and be successful within the market. You know, people take risks. Sometimes it doesn't work out, but the reason it shouldn't work out is not because you just have no chance because of big companies that exclude you from things. because they throw around their market power. So,
You break up giant
affordable
meat
seeds,
companies.
more affordable bringing the cattle to market, more affordable, all of this to make it easier on people. And I know how hard this is going to be. It's not easy. But if we don't start doing something about it, we're just going to see more of it. And by the way, once you start being aggressive about this or change the laws even a little bit, companies start making different calculations of how they're going to behave. So even without having to bring a case, things change. Or they start doing, as Bill Baer, the head of Antitrust under Obama, said, they were seeing deals that should have never made it out of the boardroom. Well, maybe they won't make it out of the boardroom if people see a different standard in place. So there is this incentives that will take place even by making some changes, minor changes to the law and funding for the agency. So don't feel like, oh, this just can't happen. Look at the past. We did a lot and we kept capitalism going in this country.
Okay, we have another question. What do we do about the quote state capture of Iowa by the meatpacking industry, the Farm Bureau, and the Koch brothers?
Mm-hmm. Well, again, and Art and I talked about this earlier. I think so much of this is comprehensive antitrust legislation to allow more competitors in place. And it is some things targeted specifically to go on with conditions and the like so that we can bring back small business and fairness, because it's not good for anyone. It's not just the producers. It's not good for anyone if you have got that huge economic loss that we saw that Art was referring to earlier.
Is this a way to win back Detroit Lakes?
Well, I think as someone that has done, as you know, I don't know how many times I said it on the debate stage, who wins in rural areas. I think this is part of it. I think it is understanding what people's individual situations are, which I've tried to do with this book, and then take it and put it in those big picture complex areas to see how you can make things better. And it's having people's backs. And I think it's one of the reasons that you see Joe Biden doing so well, because he basically said, you guys don't want to help on a COVID relief package. Guess what? I'm going to find an archaic Senate procedure. And we did, with something called a reconciliation, and we're going to get it through. We're going to vote for 36 hours, 20 minutes apart, in which no one kind of thought some of our members would do, but they did. We stay unified, and we got that done. And it righted the economy, and it got the vaccines out, and we're starting to see a better world right now. So you just have to have the will to do it. And just as I have to have the will to say I have to go soon because my husband wants to have dinner.
As does mine. Okay, we have another question. What is the impact of on wages?
What a great question. That's a good way to end, I think, too, because so often we get caught into talking about this, understandably, with innovation and small businesses and the whole economy and how it works together. But wages are key here. If you are someone that has a particular skill and there's only one monopoly company to sell it to, you're not going to fare very well. If you're able to sell yourself, basically, and whatever skill you have to multiple companies, you're going to do better because they're going to compete for your wages. And that piece of it gets forgotten as one of the roadkill problems of monopolies, is they run over workers. And it's no surprise, as Art knows through history, that the union movement came up at the same time they were fighting with robber barons, because the unions were a way to create a counter pressure, and it was a way for people to organize. One interesting sort of non-union example of this was that there have been a few suits about wages and sort of monopoly behavior. There was one out in Silicon Valley where I think it was Steve Jobs decided that he would get his competitors for labor. Remember, they may not have been in the same market, but they needed technology people, and they agreed not to hire each other's people. So that got uncovered, and then there was huge fines that came out of that, as you can imagine. And so there could be some pretty interesting lawsuits along this area, as well as measures that can be taken. But that's one of the reasons the AFL-CIO and others want to do more when it comes to antitrust, is monopolies are not good for better wages or for workers. ask the, employees of a bunch of these monopolies in the past, including at the Pullman Company in Chicago, or, when you look back in time, a lot of this was tied into labor, right?
Well, it sounds like you've got to move on with your evening for tonight. So I just want to thank you so much for joining us.
No, it's been incredible.
Antitrust, for those of you who are interested, we have a few signed copies.
Yes.
At
In
Prairie
the
Lights.
bookstore. So is your bookstore open some now, or what are you guys doing?
Well, we are open by appointment, but we will be opening more, generally speaking,
May 15th.
May
May
15th.
15th. I was just
So-
trying to give you a little, plug there. Okay, good. May 15th. Yeah, my book will be there. And then I really appreciate you guys hosting this. It's been a great discussion. It's fun to see Art's face. And again, not to be under a time limit.
Right.
Gary,
Well, good to see you again, Senator.
fun. Okay. All right. Well, and just so you know, coming up on the Senate agenda, it couldn't be more important, the For the People Act. I'm in charge of that markup next week on Tuesday. So I've been getting ready for that and will all weekend, and then continue to push for the antitrust legislation. So anyway, thank you, everybody.
A lot of people have thanked both of you for all that you do in this spirit of antitrust. So thank you, Art Collin.
Okay.
Thank you, Senator Klobuchar.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night. Thanks,
Good night.
everybody. Bye.